project. Hi everyone, so we're looking to start at 5 past. Unfortunately, I'm not technologically advanced enough to have set up a proper Q&A, so if you do have any questions throughout, please just pop it in the chat box and I will read them out to Jo. Okay, shall we start? Yeah, I'll just admit people if anybody else comes into the waiting room. But yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us online on this dark and cold January evening. Tonight is going to be our introductory event, which will kick off our Hope and Social Change Symposium series as part of the interdisciplinary York Hope Consortium. I would like to start the event by thanking my colleagues who are also part of the consortium and who are based in the English, History and Politics departments. So Indrajit, Arnab, Sanjoy and Claire. The event wouldn't have been possible without you, and I'm delighted that you've allowed me to be part of this project. I would also like to thank our colleagues in the IGDC, Trudy from the Politics department, and my supervisors, Professor Simon Parker and Dr Sarah de Jong. So we're going to start the conversation tonight with some reflections on the concept of hope. So both Jo and I have been closely involved with the Citizenship Futures Politics of Hope project, a global collaboration convened by Dr Indrajit Roy. And I know that we both grappled with the concept of hope when we were both lucky enough to first be involved and introduced to the project. So for me, I joined the project in December 2020 from my lockdown office here in a cold, rainy York. Like most people across the world, I was concerned about the worsening coronavirus pandemic and feeling rather isolated as a result of the lockdown, and felt to be observing a systemic pushback against the BLM protests that had been ignited around the world that summer. But throughout working on the project, I've come to appreciate the concept in a new light, particularly through consideration of what Jonathan Lear calls radical hope. This he defines not as simple optimism, nor the opposite of despair, but instead a form of acceptance, to see that the past is gone and that we must learn to live with uncertainty, grief and loss. But in times of uncertainty, grief and loss, radical hope forces us to consider, imagine and even work towards the possibility of a better future. It forces collaboration, new ideas, and is something that I believe is at the forefront of all the work that aims to disrupt inequality and forge a new and better future. I'll now hand over to my colleague and fellow graduate student Jo, who I'm delighted has joined us for our opening event. And I'd like to begin by asking you, what were your hopes on the concept of hope when you were first introduced to the project?
Thank you, Mel. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Mel, for those introductory remarks. To be honest, I had never really thought much about hope, about the idea of hope or the concept, let alone differentiating it between other words like optimism, expectation, or trust. And for my own part, I was introduced to the Citizenship Futures project a year ago in January 21, when York's IGDC, the interdisciplinary centre which you've mentioned, hosted an away day, which was split across two themes. One was inclusivity in research, but the other was hope, chaired by Dr. Roy. And we discussed how far hope can be seen as a useful tool of analysis in research. And like you, I was sat at home in a cold and gloomy January day, joining a so-called away day from my dining room via Zoom as the pandemic raged on. But because of that, it seemed a bit odd, but at the same time, more important than ever, to be thinking about the idea of hope and what it means to our research. Reflecting on what we said in the away day, I then wrote a blog for the IGDC, focusing on how we can use hope as a way of analyzing the societies and the concepts which we are studying. And it was after reading this blog that Dr. Roy got in touch with me to see if I wanted to be more involved with the Citizenship Futures project. And this resulted in me organizing the Talking About Hope project, which is it's a collection of short articles or blog posts, which we're calling talk pieces, written by people from all different kinds of backgrounds, specialisms, vocations, and so on. And we call them talk pieces because they are meant to get people talking and thinking about the idea of hope and what it means in different contexts to different people. So for example, yesterday, we published a talk piece written by Dr. Molly Courtlet on the idea of hope in criminal justice and what it means to people in prison. Can we, for instance, talk of a right to hope, and do long or full life prison sentences eradicate this right to hope? So that's how I came to be part of this project, and that was my beginning to discuss the idea of hope.
Thank you. And, I'm really interested, you mentioned that you'd never much kind of thought about defining hope prior to the away day. And kind of, since being part of the project and working on various kind of manifestations of it, how has your definition perhaps changed?
Massively. The away day really got me thinking about, what hope actually is, because it's a word we use all the time, isn't it? Oh, hope to see you soon, hope it'll be a nice day tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. But what actually is hope? Is it an emotion? Is it a thought process? Is it something we do? Is it something we do alone, or is it a social, project? And is it fixed? Does it change? Does it change all the time? And I guess because I'm a history student, I got kind of interested in the history of hope and the history of the idea of hope. And so looking to the past, it's quite clear that hope, as an idea, as a philosophy, has changed quite radically over time.
And so thinking of that, how far back does this kind of idea or concept of hope go back then?
Wow. I mean, that in itself is a fascinating question, because the answer, at least as far as Europe is concerned, is hope has been with us forever. At least as far back as Greek mythology. So from the very start, we have to say that whatever hope is, however we're defining it, it has been and is an intrinsic part of human identity and human experience for as long as we know. So going far back, even 8th century BC, Hesiod said that hope was given to the world in Pandora's box. One of the great evils that he cursed, he punished mankind and the Titans with. And so why Zeus would give hope to the world along with evils, why it's counted among things like sickness and death, and why, as every schoolboy knows, it stayed in the box when Pandora put the lid on. This has puzzled philosophers ever since. And I think that Hesiod and his contemporary ancient Greek writers and philosophers, for them, hope was a deception. It was a false comforter. And it remained in the jar so that when people experienced adversity or challenge, we can metaphorically open the jar, take hope out and take comfort in it, and then crucially do nothing. We just sit back and, oh, well, we hope things will improve. You know, so say you were a farmer or a peasant farmer and you look out the window and all the crops, you know, they're withering under the sun, they're thirsty. Well, what we do then is we take Pandora's box, we take hope out, and we take comfort in the fact that, oh, we hope it will rain tomorrow. Hopefully they'll be okay. And so we just sit back and do nothing. And so in this way, hope, in that sense, sort of strips us of our agency, and it strips us of our urge to actually do something and take action. And this is similar to a point that my supervisor, Henry Soltink of the IGDC, raised in the away day, the idea that hope might be a passive force, something that encourages to just accept our reality in the vague hope that things might eventually get better.
That's really interesting. I think, you know, kind of reflecting back on both of our kind of assumptions of hope, or the way that we kind of were quite comfortable in thinking about it before, that were kind of more associated with, you know, optimism and aspiration. You know, what you're talking about there seemed to be quite like a pessimistic understanding, perhaps. When do you think hope kind of shifted to become associated with things like aspiration and optimism?
It's true that it is a very pessimistic view of hope, and quite a cynical and almost a nasty one. And yeah, you're right, we do normally associate hope with optimism or aspiration. You know, things can get better, things will be better. And I think that sort of began with Plato, you know, still ancient Greek, but much more recent. And he agreed that, yeah, on the one hand, hope can be exploited, it can make people do nothing. But he also began to speak of a sort of different type of hope, a higher hope, or truer hope. And for him, that was the hope that through philosophy and the study of the Platonist forms, as he called them, or these ideals, we can reach a truer and a higher knowledge, which makes us better humans, basically.
So almost like a belief in like something greater, perhaps?
Yeah, like a belief in a higher knowledge, you know, as opposed to something just ordinary and everyday. And I think crucially for Plato, it was something that was higher, but also something achievable. You know, we can strive towards this higher knowledge through study, through rigorous philosophy. You know, it's no longer a passive thing. We just sit down, have a cup of tea, and hope for nice things. It's now active. You know, it's concomitant with a presumed doing of something. And so I think, to skip forward in history a little bit, this idea of an active hope and a belief in something greater translated well into religions, especially, you know, beginning with Judaism, which saw this greater thing to be God, you know, and God's promise that he would, you know, dwell again with his chosen people.
Definitely. And I mean, you've just touched there on something that I know has come up in previous conversations that we've been involved in, which is faith. I think I'd be quite interested to hear, perhaps, you know, do these same ideas of hope apply to Christianity? And also, you know, you've briefly touched upon there, like belief, and how's hope different from things like, you know, belief and faith?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we get to the Christian philosophy and theology, we have these three things. You know, there's belief, there's hope, there's faith. What's the difference? Well, to beginning with St. Paul, you know, he elevated hope to a divine status. You know, there's the divine trinity of virtues of hope, faith, and love. And I think for St. Paul, the object of what Plato called the true hope, the higher hope, was salvation, of course, you know, the belief in a life to come. This was the divine theological hope, you know, that St. Paul talked about, rather than the so-called passionate hopes, which relates to things like, you know, I hope it'll be nice weather tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, that does then flirt with the idea of belief. Well, what's belief as opposed to hope? And that is something that Christian theologians and philosophers argued over for literally 1,000 years. From St. Augustine to Aquinas, scholars continued this sort of Plato idea of lesser and higher hopes. For them, the lesser hopes were things like, you know, I hope it rains soon, I hope, you know, this food's nice. But the higher hopes, like I said, was based on a belief in a life beyond this one, in salvation, in God, etc. But if you have hope and you have faith, then what's the difference between the two? And this all sort of came to a head with, Peter Lombard in the 12th century. How can you square hope and faith? If you have faith, why do you need hope? If you're hoping for salvation, then maybe your faith isn't strong enough. And so this was a huge sort of crisis moment, if you like. Lombard kind of got around it by saying hope was a certain belief in salvation to come. So hope is belief in the present, in good to come in the future. But that's a kind of redefinition of hope, because most people's definition of hope, certainly mine, doesn't include certainty.
Yeah, and I mean, with all the kind of concepts that you've touched upon that are kind of associated or, been associated with ideas around hope, lack of certainty seems to come up with that. And I'd again like to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts are on that. Does a lack of certainty almost go hand in hand with hope?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say absolutely. Because I think, that goes some way to a key concept of the Citizenship Futures project, which is how do we differentiate, as we've been saying, between hope and other terms like optimism and expectation. And I would say that hope has to be uncertain and inconsistent and adaptable. And one of Indrajit Roy's key notions is that hope is disappointable.
That's really interesting. I think before we move on to some more questions, I'd just be quite interested to hear, with the faith hope kind of disagreement and problem, did it ever get resolved? Is it, what's kind of the thoughts on it now?
I don't think it ever really did get resolved at all. Like so many, I mean, we are still talking about it. And not that we pretend to be great theologians or philosophers, but we have been thinking about hope for a while and we've not worked it out.
Yeah.
What did happen though was it sort of got blown out the water by the Reformation, as did so many things. And Martin Luther in particular radically changed ideas of a theological hope, particularly as it relates to faith. He sort of more or less dropped hope, saying that faith is all that really matters. Faith is an act of grace. It comes from God. And once you have faith, nothing else essentially matters. Ergo, if you have a strong faith, then you don't need hope.
Right. And then what kind of became of hope then after the kind of Reformation period? What did like Enlightenment philosophers, for example, have to say about the concept?
Well, it kind of went under several sort of transformations, I suppose. In the Enlightenment, in Enlightenment philosophy and critical thought, we still have this two-tier system of hope, if you like, that sort of Plato began to talk about. We have a lower hope about day-to-day things and a higher hope, which is, as we've said before, a belief in a bigger, better, greater than ourselves something towards which we can strive. But for Enlightenment thinkers, I think, that higher hope, it obviously wasn't God or salvation explicitly. This is because, Locke, 17th, 18th century, he said that a central tenet of the Enlightenment must be that our belief in something must be commensurate with the reliability of the evidence. Well, objectively speaking, the evidence of salvation isn't good, so that can't be our basis of hope. Therefore, Enlightenment philosophers grounded their hopes not in God or faith, but in human understanding, in reason, in truth, and in the rational method. And that's a little like the revisionist late sort of Plato and his basing hope in the realization of an ultimate knowledge, something that we can access through self-control and through philosophy and through understanding of our world. And then, later on in the 18th century, that kind of reached a peak with Kant, who said that hope can have a systemic importance, to philosophy, to thought. And he made it almost like a new trinity, because his philosophy was built around three questions, what do I know? What can I do? And what do I hope? So Kant reintroduces hope as a very central, very important thing in his philosophy. And by applying these questions to everyday experience and through working through them with recourse to his own reason, Kant said that we can achieve the highest good for ourselves and our fellow man, which was this higher hope, this ultimate hope that we should all aspire to.
Thank you for that again. And I think, you know, based on what you've been saying there, do you think it would be fair to kind of conceptualize hope then as a belief in a better future, and a real possibility that we can kind of get there?
Yeah, so I think, time is really important to hope. Hopes are in the future, I think, and also achievability is crucial, as we've already said. To bring it up to the present, later philosophers like Nietzsche, said, well, certainly in his younger years, he kind of returned to the idea of hope as a deception, as an illusion, carried around in this Pandora's box that strips us of agency. Because for young Nietzsche, at least, hope was necessary because it made life bearable. It was almost like a drug. And I think if we contextualize that, in the industrialization, the birth of the new working class, you can understand why someone might say hope is an illusion. And in my mind, that's almost reminiscent of Marx's comments on religion, saying it's the opiate of the masses. It's an illusion that numbs us to injustice and futility and reality.
No, that's really, really, interesting thoughts on hope. And I think, we've thought about different definitions, but a common theme that kind of keeps coming up there is hope as like a belief in something better, in a better future, or some kind of good future that can be achieved. And yeah, with that in mind, I'm going to turn to another key theme in the project, which is the role of hope in social movements and as a force for, good, positive social change. And with that, we've been talking about, do you think hope is important for social movements? How important do you think it is as well?
I would say that hope is crucial to successful social movements, at least. Yeah, I do. I think it is important. If we run with the idea that hope is a belief in something in the future, something that's better, and something that we can achieve, then surely that's exactly what social movements believe in and are built around. That's what they organize themselves around, and that's why they take actions that they do, especially risky actions, dangerous action. And so, to bring it to my research, my PhD looks at post-colonial history and politics and development in the Caribbean, especially in Antigua and Barbuda. And I think thinking in terms of social movements, their struggle for independence is a really good example of hope being crucial for successful and ongoing social movements. So in their case, the better future that they were aspiring to, that they imagined, was an independent, democratic Antigua free from British influence and control and colonial meddling. That was the ultimate goal that they looked towards. And I think, that we might call the Platonist higher hope, or the Pauline, the divine hope that they imagined. But of course, that's not a blind faith. I think crucially, because it was achievable. They looked around their world and saw, from Trinidad to Jamaica and in Africa, their fellow colonial states had gone through similar struggles and achieved independence and democracy and self-representation. And so they knew that it was something that was achievable, but it wasn't expected for them. It wasn't guaranteed. It was like the other side of the same coin. It wasn't a certain hope, because at the time, 1960s, say, Antigua was a tiny little country, and yeah, bigger states like Trinidad and Jamaica that I mentioned, had gone ahead and rushed on with their own independence. But little developing islands like Antigua remained trapped in a halfway house of associated statehood. So it wasn't guaranteed that these small, impoverished, underdeveloped states would be able to go on as their cousins, if you like, had, and achieve independence. So I think that's the role of hope in Antiguan anti-colonialism. It provided like a common objective for the country to work towards, and it brought together hugely diverse groups of people, from businessmen to educated to peasants to workers to sugar farmers, under the broad umbrella of a single united hope i.e. an independent country. And I think it gave, anti-colonial campaigners the motivation and the stimulation they needed to pursue that goal, which at times surely was, it must have seemed unimaginably difficult, if not impossible to achieve.
Definitely. And I think, as you're talking through that, I think it's quite profound, to consider hope as like a unifying concept almost. And it, really made me think about just last week I was a protest in Leeds to do with a bill that's currently going through Parliament. And, we arrived there with the kind of, our thoughts as to why the bill was particularly problematic and dangerous. As I got off the train, I was quite surprised, but also warmed at seeing so many different groups of kind of probably different reasons why they were there, and they saw different issues with the bill, but all kind of coming together, in the hope that doing this at this demonstration would kind of, we're all unified by the shared understanding that the bill was dangerous and perhaps that we could trigger some form of change. And I think, in these extremely like polarizing times, it definitely gave me like a sense of hope in that it, there is within social movements, it's quite unifying. It brings us all together over certain issues, and I think that really speaks to what you've just said there. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think, because so many people have like different concerns in one space, we can also learn from each other in a way. I think, having been in that environment, I learn about various different people's struggles, which I imagine again in the situation in Antigua, all those different people from different backgrounds also use that unifying space to learn and improve understandings. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating because, I spoke of hope as like an umbrella, an idea that brings people together, but it's more than that, isn't it? Going off on what you said, actually, because there's something active that hope does to the people that it brings together. It acts on the groups that it forms, and makes them more than the sum of their parts, which is absolutely fascinating. But something, that I think certainly in Antigua's case I've been thinking about, and we'll see how things go with the bill in Parliament, but is it worth thinking about what happens when hopes are actually achieved, if they are achieved?
Yeah, I do. That is a really interesting point, actually. I think particularly when we think about hope in more of like a unifying way that kind of drives social movements or unites individuals under kind of, protesting or working against systems of oppression. Yeah, I think it's kind of got me thinking about the context of like decolonial work, perhaps in more of a university context, particularly in the West, where like the small battles may be won, we might manage to kind of, achieve small objectives or even objectives that seem large, but the kind of wider decolonial project, to me anyway, it's never quite over, right? It can never quite be done in a tangible sense. So I wonder, what that says about thinking about hope in both of these contexts. Is it important not to lose sight of perhaps like the broader kind of mission and the fact that that might not, in a sense, be actually achievable?
Yes, absolutely. And this was when we were talking about this and exchanging some notes before,
Mm.
I spoke of, I gave the example, sticking with Antigua, I said that, their hope was independence, self-governance, and that's what united them. And then as soon as that was achieved in 67, as soon as they got what they were hoping for, if you like, it all collapsed. That one uniting force disappeared, and the country, all those different groups that I mentioned, they fell to infighting and factionalism and polarization and a really hostile political environment, which has never gone away since. Which made me think, that's what made me say, well, what if we achieve these hopes? Then what happens? We've lost what we were going towards because we're in the future, so now we collapse. But what you say about, particularly in colonial, post-colonial research context, is there hope that it's always ongoing and is never achievable? And I think that's such a thought-provoking point. And I would say yes, actually. Thinking about it, in Antigua's case, yeah, they achieved self-governance, which, yeah, was what they were hoping for, and later on full independence. But was that really the achievement of their actual goal. And when you think about it, actually, no, because though they were politically independent, Antigua remained, and I elsewhere have argued remains, hugely dependent on foreign, usually white, investment and tourism, which leads to manipulation and an indirect form of sort of neo-colonial control. So while they may be politically independent, they're not actually independent at all as a state. And so that hope that they aspired to has never really been achieved. And maybe that's because hopes of that kind are never realizable, because they are usually or always grounded in this higher thing, which we've been talking about before, which is almost divine, it's almost non-human. So how can we achieve that? Like pure freedom and pure independence. Those things, are they even compatible with modern life, with reality? Can a country be independent, of any interference and being fully in control of itself while still part of a global capitalist economy? No, perhaps I don't think that's possible. So then maybe hope is like a mediator between our aspirations and our higher vision of complete self-control, for instance, and the reality that you can never be fully in control of yourself. No state can be purely on its own and independent, apart from North Korea, say. So maybe hope is a mediator between those two things, between lesser hopes and higher hopes. Or, which then takes us back to Plato, I guess, this idea of this lower passion base hope and the higher hope. Maybe all hope are aspirational, but we have higher hopes and we have lower hopes. And so to go like your protest, the lower hope was that the bill would be defeated or dropped. But the higher hope that you had perhaps was that protest works, that you have a voice, that democracy, that the democratic method makes good outcomes that we can all support and live with. In Antigua's case, the lower hope was self-governance, but the higher hope was freedom and independence. And so in this sense, yes, the lower hope is always realizable. It's something that we can actually achieve and often do, but the higher hope is almost necessarily something that's, it's ongoing. It's always a bit out of reach, and it's never assured. So maybe that, a higher hope and a lower hope is perhaps a good way of thinking about, this idea of hope, something in the future, something better, something good, etc. Don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. I mean, again, we could sit here all evening, I'm sure, and back and forth with these questions, but I'm conscious that people in the audience probably also have some questions that they want to ask you. So I'm going to give a reminder to everybody, if you do have some questions, please do type them out in the chat box. And I'm going to ask my final question, if that's okay, which is, are there any interesting observations that you've taken from conversations with people about hope, or any interesting insights as to how they understand the concept, perhaps?
I mean, just like this conversation, it almost raises more questions than you can ever hope to answer, which I love. It's really enjoyable, and I think it's so much fun to just dive into a really wonderful and bizarre concept as hope, and I'm so grateful to Roy for introducing us to it. But especially because it's something that we talk about all the time. It's such a commonplace of English parlance, isn't it? Hope. I'm sure there's been studies, but it would be interesting to know how many times a day we say hope. When we spoke earlier, I think you used it, accidentally. I was like, oh, you said hope. So just this sort of general macro ideas about hope I've been, thinking about for a whole year now. But if I were to say that one thing that's really stuck in my head right now is it's actually this most recent talk piece that we've published by Dr. Molly Courtlet. And she works, as I mentioned, no, I didn't mention, she works for the Howard League of Penal Reform. I think that's right, Howard League for Penal Reform. And her post is, as I mentioned, and people should go away and read it, but it's about hope in criminal justice system, and in particular, the idea of the right to hope. And so what that obviously begins to say is there such a thing as a human right to hope? Are we all entitled to a degree of hope? And she sort of applies this, or she discusses it in the context of prisons and prison inmates. And in 2013, there was a legal case at the European Court of Human Rights saying, I think Winter, they were sentenced, or their person was represented, sentenced to a full life prison term. And this was taken to the Court of Human Rights, which eventually determined that a full life prison sentence without the possibility of parole or redress, or retrial, sorry, actually contravened Article 3 of the Convention of Human Rights, which I think guards against torture and inhumane punishment, etc. And this was, the judges said, because if there's no chance that you'll get out of prison, if there's no chance of freedom in the future, again, this idea of a better future that we can aspire to, then that's a cruel and unusual, as the Americans say, punishment. And it strips you of your human rights, and it's degrading and it's dehumanizing. And it's also silly, because if you strip people of this belief in a better future that they can achieve and work towards, then you're not incentivizing rehabilitation and being a good prisoner and a good person, etc. And so I think it's really interesting to think of hope as a right. That's what's going through my mind right now. Something that is inalienable to each of us. It's part of our nature. And I think, reflecting on the conversation we've had, as St. Paul, would have said, hope is a gift from God. It's grace. It's part of creation. Or as the early discussions show, all the way back to the earliest literature that we have, it's a constant part of human history. It's a fundamental part of who we are, how we think about ourselves, and how we perceive our place in the world. The oldest creation myths are built around hope. They have hope at their core. So it's clearly a crucial part of what it is to be human. And I know that's a really crazily big idea to end that answer on, but that's what's been going through my mind right now. The idea of hope as a human right and as a fundamental part of who we are.
No, that's so interesting. Thank you so much again, and thank you for all of your insights this evening. I think I just want to ask the audience again if anybody does have questions. I've written a few down as you've been talking, but I'm conscious that I've asked quite a lot, so please do put your hands up as well. I think you've all got the ability to unmute and speak, but if you could also post some questions in the chat. We've got until 6.
Could I, please, Mel, if that's okay, ask Jo a question, and feel free, Mel, also to come in on this. Thanks, Jo. I mean, of course, it's fascinating to hear you talk about your ideas of hope. And as I've said, I'm very grateful that you sort of shared them when you did back when we had the away day at the IGDC, and generally chatting about your understandings of hope and the discontents, as it were, with the concept, but also how we might sort of think with it. Now, like you've said, hope is, of course, an idea, and there is a tendency of to think about hope in idealistic terms, in terms of just an idea, a notion. I was wondering if you thought there was, and you've alluded a bit to this when you talked about the anti-colonial struggles within which the hope in Antigua was sort of embedded. But I wondered if you thought there was a realistic dimension, if you will, to hope, a materialistic as opposed to idealistic dimension to hope. Did you think there might be ways of thinking about hope that were anchored in a realist sort of understanding of the world? And I here use realist not necessarily in the way in which international relations scholars use it, but in terms of thinking about realism as opposed to idealism, or more anchored in a materialist sort of way of thinking about the world. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether or not hope can be about realism and whether or not hope can be realistic.
Thank you, Indrajit. And I always have thoughts. Whether they answer your question is another thing. Realism as opposed to idealism. So yeah, hopes in the future, usually when they're aspirational, they're going to be idealistic. They're going to be almost perfect types. I think that maybe applies to this idea of a higher type, this the supreme, almost deistic ideal type, things like we've mentioned, freedom of the individual, independence of nation states, or in Mel's example, the successful efficacy of the democratic method and the goodness of politicians, the fact that we have a voice. These are ideal types. Realistic types, I think, perhaps, are maybe the lesser hopes. And I don't mean that in like a disparaging way. They're still really important and amazing. I think the title lesser is useful. So things like getting a government to drop a bill because it's, blatantly evil, or small incremental steps towards independence, like self-governance, more representation, wider vote franchise, suffrage. These are real things. These are things that people have explicitly hoped for, that they've said and written that they've hoped for and campaigned for and have achieved. And in some cases, not all, but once you have that and you put it in law, then it's there. You own it. You can almost touch it and hold it and possess it. So these are very real things, very material, I think, in the non-literal sense. So I think hopes can be material as well as ideal. They're not always perfect. They can be material because they are made for our world, for our real world, with other people, with conflicting ideas, with economic systems, with ideologies that we have to grapple and deal with. So they can be rugged and messy and adaptable. So I think that's what I think. I hope that answers the question, and I wonder what Mel thinks as well about your question.
Yes, Mel, go for it. I mean, I think it's a very useful distinction, this higher and lesser, without the disparaging sort of sense. It's, I suppose, what one might call the distinction between utopia and hope, where there is this sense of perfectibility, which might chime in with what you're calling higher hope, and a sense of hope, as in, which is more realistic. But that's just, I suppose, my rather arbitrary way of distinguishing between things. But yes, Mel, I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think to kind of add to that, I think I would agree. And I think when it does come to, thinking about hope, particularly with the example that I used, that I think that perhaps the more, the lesser hopes are the more tangible hopes. But I think, as you were talking there, Jo, I did start to kind of feel, in the kind of world that we're in now, particularly in the UK context, we often talk about going backwards on like things that we might have achieved. So, we feel, particularly in social justice movements, look at this is a tangible thing. We brought this bill in that is supposed to protect us from racial discrimination, or that gives more protection to groups that might be excluded. But in a kind of time where there's perhaps a reversal of this, I also start, again, this is just thrown some whole new thoughts as to what we're saying, but when it comes to these like lesser hopes, when they are tangible, what happens when they are reversed, or when the kind of goals that have been achieved, let's say, are reversed? And I think that goes back to what we were saying about the more broader conceptual idea that might perhaps never be realised, perhaps, a world without racism, a world without oppression, a world without inequality. That doesn't answer the question in any way, shape or form, but I think just as you were talking, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to jump in there as well, something said made me think that hopes are vulnerable. They're delicate things. They can be threatened. Things that we take for granted, like, which we shouldn't, because we know history, but progress, more rights, liberty, these being good things, not necessarily, these can be reversed, which is why hope is so important, and it's so important to have these sorts of discussions.
I mean, that just got me thinking. You made this point earlier, Jo. We often start our emails by saying, "Hope you're well," for instance. And I've sometimes got back the answer saying, "No, I'm not." Which is exactly to say, hope is a delicate thing. You expect somebody to be well, or you hope somebody is well. They may not be, and then they sort of remind you that there is that vulnerability about hope. Or I think you mentioned earlier, we've talked about hope being disappointable, and so many people say when you say hope you're doing well, and they say sadly I'm not, or whatever. So I think that there is an element to hope that is about being fragile, about being reversed, to use that term you used, Mel. And I guess that makes it realistic in the sense that both of you have suggested. But thanks so much again.
That's okay.
No, thank you.
Also, you've Indrajit, when you said in your emails, hope you're well. You just reminded me that when I was speaking to someone about this and the definition thing, they said, well, we got talking about it, and then this led into discussion, and we said, well, what is the difference between hope and trust and expect? And so in that case, oh, I hope you're well. Well, why do you hope that? How do you hope that? What does it mean to hope? And so we ended up by sort of thinking, well, maybe a key part of hope is this achievable aspiration element, which implies, doing something, that you are going to do something to achieve the hope. So if you hope, in Mel's case, we hope the bill is dropped. Yeah, but what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to join a protest in London. Oh, I hope Antigua's independent one day. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to join the workers' union and protest for my rights. Contrast that to, oh, I hope it's sunny tomorrow. Well, what are you going to do to make it sunny? Well, what can you do? Nothing, obviously. Oh, I hope this email finds you well. Well, what have you done to make sure I'm well? You're not sent me a hamper or whatever. So maybe we should start saying trust. I trust this email finds you well. Rather than hope, and we can start to use hope more sensibly and in a stricter way, perhaps.
I think that's really helpful. I'll be careful about saying hope you're well in future, precisely because I'm not doing anything. The least I could do is not send them the email, perhaps, but sending them the email. But thanks. I think this is really, really useful and more stuff to think about. Thanks, Jo. Thanks, Mel.
No, thank you. I think we've got one question in the chat. I'll put it to you, Jo, if you don't mind, as we've not got that long left. So the past 2 years have been particularly difficult and uncertain for people across the globe due to the pandemic. How do you think your understanding of hope has perhaps changed throughout this period?
Well, like I said in the beginning, it was in January 21 when I got introduced to this whole topic and concept and project. So because of that, my understanding of hope has been completely transformed, born, let alone transformed. And, like I said at the beginning, during that away day, we were all kind of aware of how weird it was to be talking about hope in the middle of a global pandemic. But at the same time, we said, well, there's never more important time to talk about hope. We need hope more than ever, particularly in the more conventional sense of thinking about hope. But I think, the pandemic's been really interesting because in such a short space of time and in such a relatively simple way, it's one virus, that affects humans. That's comparatively simple compared to, the rest of human life and existence. In a very short amount of time, in a simple way, it's shown us that there are lots of reasons to despair, and lose hope, lose faith in things that we took for granted, like healthcare, responsible governments, dare I say, the fact that we're humans and, we know what's going on in this world and we can protect ourselves. That all went out the window. And, maybe, a lot of people started to despair and feel hopeless. But then there's also been reasons to hope, of course, vaccines, dare I say, what more do you need to say? And again, maybe not to keep pressing this point, I feel like I'm preaching, but maybe if we want to talk about higher and lower hopes, a lower hope in terms of vaccinations, we can make a vaccine and, we won't all suffer on account of this virus. A higher hope is that we have, this hope, this trust, this faith, this belief, whatever, in science, in the scientific method, in medicine, in technology, which can and will hopefully always come to our aid, and the experience of the pandemic has supported that higher hope as a sensible thing to believe and to follow and to maintain. So I think the pandemic's given us reason to despair, it's given us reason to hope, and it's given us reason to reformulate our hopes and adapt them and change them, which is a key aspect of hope, that it is plastic, that it can change and adapt. So I think that's sort of the answer. What do you think, Mel?
No, I mean, I was just I was thinking of a question to ask you actually on what you were just saying, which is, to do with the more intersecting issues that the pandemic has raised. There is this kind of, dare I say, unifying pain that we're all going through at the moment and have been for the past, however long, which is that we as a global community are experiencing it, and there are the kind of lesser hopes of the vaccine, for example, but that the pandemic's also kind of thrown up massive issues, to do with money around the world, who has access, and that isn't just to do with this particular vaccine, right? That's to do with access, to do with any sort of healthcare or other global inequalities that have been thrown up by the pandemic. And so I suppose I wanted to, sorry to deflect, but throw it back to you really, just as it kind of seemed to be going on that, what are your thoughts to the other inequalities that have been thrown up? We do have, perhaps considering the more tangible things to do with the pandemic, is lesser hopes, and then the broader kind of issues is higher.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're completely right that the pandemic and our response to it, I think, is key. It has shown many more negative things, like inequality being the big one. And I think the big example of that, well, I mean, there's two main ones that leap to mind, the effect that we're not all in it together, because, if it just in the UK alone, if you're working class or a person of color, you're much more likely to come into contact with the virus. You're much more likely to suffer on account of it, with it, have worse symptoms, and you're much more likely to have repeat exposure. Work from home, for example. Well, how are you meant to do that if X, Y, Z? Then the second one, globally, is, the really ugly thing, I think, which no one seems to mention anymore, is vaccine nationalism. Do you remember when, the UK was going to be the vaccine factory of the world, and the US was going to vaccinate, billion people or whatever? Don't hear much about that anymore, because we, as so often is the case, just naturally fell into, in-group, out-group, got to protect the in-group, got to protect my people first. And that was very ugly. But exposing ugliness like that gives rise to new hopes, perhaps. We can now hope that if this happens again, we won't act like that because we've learned. Maybe we can hope that the next time this happens, we'll be better prepared. We'll put more trust in our, in our Chris Whitties of the future, and we'll know how to do this. So we'll be able to overcome it quicker, and we'll be able to be less nationalistic, less unequal in the way that we handle ourselves and handle the virus and our response to it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And sorry, I do apologise, but that was on my mind as you were talking, and it leads on quite nicely to another question that we've been asked, which is, would you agree that politicians are now less focused on hope and more focused on fear? Would you like to go first?
I think this is a corking question. Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. And I think in a way that one question summarizes a lot of what we might want to talk and think about when it comes to hope and modern politics. And yes, in the semi-recent past, if you think about people like Kennedy, we stand on the threshold of a new, brave new frontier. You know, the aspiration and the optimism and the fact that, yes, it is achievable. You know, the best speech ever made, in my view, you know, the Rice University speech, you know, we choose to go to the moon and we will go to the moon. You know, that hope and aspiration in a higher whatever, that it was achievable and we can do it by taking action now. That was amazing. Or more recently, Obama, you know, hope, just the word was on so many posters all the time. And his slogan was, yes, we can. And that, you know, is hope in a slogan. That's aspiration, you know, and belief in, etc. Whereas now, you know, as David is implying, it's almost flipped, you know. And if we think about, you know, Trump, not going to be rude, but I won't be rude. If we think about Trump, you know, his slogan, it was almost an inversion, you know, and it wasn't, not that this was an official slogan, but it wasn't, yes, we can. His stance was, no, you can't. You know, no, you can't come into our country. No, you can't, you know, have your religion. No, you can't let two guys get married in your church. No, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't. And yeah, that is based on fear. You know, the fear of, well, what happens, you know, if a few thousand Mexican people come into the country? What happens if we let, you know, same-sex couples get married and adopt children? What happens if we give, you know, women control of their bodies? You know, making fear and breaking down hope and aspiration seems to be what that brand of politics was and is all about. So yeah, absolutely. Whether there is room for hope in our current political climate, I'm not sure. If one looks at, you know, the Labour Party in the UK, for instance, I'm not sure what hope there is there. Not that I'm saying they're a hopeless party, but what is their aspiration? What is the higher goal that they think we should aspire to and that we can achieve if they're in government? Ditto with Biden. I don't know what his, you know, what his hope is. So it's not just that there is a politics of fear, and it was for a time and probably is still winning. It's also that where's the politics of hope's gone? I don't know where that is anymore.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think it did make me think, you know, more my like areas of interest to do with politics is to do with immigration. And I was thinking, you know, where is the hope in that? It does seem to be driven by, you know, this constant fear, as it has been for as far as I can see for a very long time in the UK context, you know, a fear of being swamped, a fear of who's your next door neighbour, a fear of people who are othered and made out to be unknown. And so yeah, I think it in that context absolutely is driven by fear. And again, I think it goes back to a point that we were talking about earlier, with this kind of reversal. You know, we're looking now at a time where the Human Rights Act is coming into question, you know, all these different things. But the driving force behind these is a fear that they were used for, you know, reasons that the government didn't necessarily agree with. You know, the fear that someone, I think one was driven by Theresa May, that someone might have been able to stay in the country because of their cat, you know, despite her apparently committing a crime, that you know, they were able to stay here. So it all seems to be driven by fear. I couldn't agree more. I think it is a really profound but a little bit depressing point, really. And I do wonder, perhaps my final point for you, Jo, I'm not going to speak again as we only have a minute, is how do you think we get from, you know, this politics of fear and the mobilizing power of fear back to hope?
I mean, well, that is the question, isn't it? I'm glad you've asked it, though, because to end on, you know, Trump and Theresa May and, you know, such a bleak point to end on, you know, considering we're talking about hope. You know, so where do we get back to a politics of hope, or how do we create our own a new politics of hope? Where do hopes come from? What is, you know, it goes back to what is hope. And I guess one thing that we sort of mentioned when we talked about the pandemic is that all these awful things happened, but they gave rise to new hopes, or it shone a light on hopes that maybe we hadn't really thought about, like hope that, you know, in the future we can continue to place our trust in science and medicine, you know. So I think that often hopes are spontaneous. they make themselves, you know, and they crop up at times where you don't necessarily expect them. So maybe it's not necessarily for me to say where the hope of the future will come from. Maybe it will just pop up one day, you know, almost spontaneously. But for the time being, you know, I take hope when I look around, you know, the good things that are happening now, you know, people like you protesting, you know, against some of the many things this government's doing. I look at, you know, what Biden is managing to do in America. I look at certain things that are going on in Caribbean politics. I look around the world. I look at the end of the pandemic, whatever that means, whatever an end to a pandemic really means in this case. And yeah, there is cause for hope. Absolutely, there is. Where we channel that and how we channel that into politics, that's the key issue. But I'm not a politician, thankfully.
Thankfully neither am I. So I'm just, we've got, let me just pop it in to everybody. I've just got a few notices, but I do also want to share Jo's email address, just in case, you know, people do want to continue the conversation through the Talking About Hope project by emailing them there. Thank you so much for tonight. I'm sure I say this on behalf of most people in the audience, but it's been such an interesting conversation that I've been looking forward to all week. And yeah, thank you for everybody for coming today. Please do keep an eye out on our Twitter and YouTube accounts for our upcoming instalments. So the Twitter account is Futures of Hope, and we have our next event. Eric's actually in the audience, who will be doing the next event next week this time. So keep an eye out again on the Twitter account for the Zoom link. The title is Hope in the Time of Settler Colonialism, Indigenous Demands of Justice and Multicultural Political Theory. And Eric was born and raised in Mexico City and recently passed his Viva with minor corrections and is interested in comparative political theory, identity and historical injustice. And I've also just realised we also have Ian in the audience, who I believe is presenting sometime in mid-February as well. So yeah, these conversations are going to be ongoing, so please keep an eye out on our social media. Thanks again, Jo. I'm not sure whether you or Indrajit want to have anything to say before I close the meeting.
No, I don't think so. Just thank you for hosting and fun questions, and yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Jo, and thanks everyone for being here on this cold January, apparently hopeless evening, but really, as Jo and Mel have suggested, that's not the case. But thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Bye.
Bye.